Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Jude Ellis, head of anti-doping at the International Paralympic Committee, or IPC. And today we're going to talk more about the IPC and clean sport efforts in the Paralympic movement. So, Jude, we're so happy to have you today. Welcome to the show, and how are you?
Thank you. I'm very good.
Well, we are delighted to learn more about you and the wonderful work that you're doing, but perhaps you could start by just telling us more about yourself and your current role.
Sure. So I'm a Kiwi. I come from New Zealand. I've been at the IPC for nearly 5 years. When I first came here, I thought it was only for a couple of years, but I'm still here. I began at the IPC as an anti-doping manager, and then, almost 2 years ago, the head position came up. So yeah, I've been doing that for the last couple of years.
Fantastic. And I know you've had a particularly interesting career path. I love talking to people in anti-doping about their paths because I think everyone takes a slightly different route here. So can you talk about your path?
So I was a sports mad Kiwi growing up. I loved sport, played every sport, always had an interest in sport, represented New Zealand in rowing and women's rugby. It was just such a blast. And I remember, I'm going to age myself here, but 1988, the Ben Johnson at the Games. That was when I was on the cusp of first going for New Zealand, and I've always had this interest in drugs and sport, and Ben Johnson happened. And then I was back at university to do some postgrad studies, and I decided to do a paper on drugs and sport. This was in 1993, I think, so yeah, I'm really old. And Graham Steele, who was the chief executive of what is now the Drug Free Sport New Zealand, the CEO of what used to be the NATO, was doing seminars and recruiting chaperones. So I began as a chaperone in 1993 and quickly became a DCO and worked as a DCO for a squillion years. And I also was fortunate enough to carve out a career working in the New Zealand sports sector. So I worked for the New Zealand Sports Government Commission, if you like, and working on coaching and sport development and major events. And then eventually the position at the New Zealand NATO came up, managing the testing program there. So I took that, and then after about 7 or 8 years, I started to get bored, and there was an opportunity at IPC. And it fulfilled a long life dream of mine to live and work in Europe. So it sort of combined everything. I wanted to keep working in anti-doping, and it was a real adventure coming to Bonn in Germany, and I'm just loving it. So I feel very lucky. It's all about opportunities.
Absolutely. I think following those opportunities as they arise can build a fascinating and really fulfilling career path. And you've had a lot of different experiences relevant for anti-doping. You sort of bring the athlete perspective, the DCO or doping control officer, NATO leadership, all of these different angles.
Yeah. I also dabbled, actually. I was a national age group rowing coach for a couple of years. So I had athletes that were peeing in jars too, if you like. But I'm actually, I'm really conscious that while that experience is really useful, it was a long time ago. And no athlete today wants to hear in my day, but certainly it's really helped me with my job.
Certainly. And now you've been with the IPC for some time now. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organization in particular, maybe its history and what it's like today?
Well, when I started at the IPC, there were probably around, I think, just over 100 people working. There's 133 people there now from 44 countries. The IPC is a non-profit organisation. It's based in Bonn in Germany, and it was established in 1989. So it's grown hugely over the last few years. The IPC's vision is basically to make an inclusive world through parasport, so using parasport to include everybody. And our mission is basically to lead the Paralympic movement, deliver the Paralympic Games, and we want to support our members to help their para-athletes achieve sporting excellence. So it's a very cool organisation. There are people from so many countries here, and it's a really fantastic organisation to work for.
Wonderful. So can you share perhaps the scope of who you serve? Who are these members of the IPC?
183, or it might be 185 national Paralympic committees around the world. We also have international organisations for sports with disabilities. So, for example, Virtus and IPSA. And we also have some IF members who are part of the Games program. IF stands for International Federation. So those are our key members.
Very cool. And in terms of your specific role there in anti-doping, you lead the anti-doping team there at the IPC. What are the main responsibilities of your group?
Well, a lot of people might not appreciate about the IPC is the Paralympic Games is our showpiece event, right? So for the anti-doping purposes, we're the MEO for the Paralympic Games, but we also act as the IF for 5 sports: athletics, swimming, powerlifting, shooting, and para ice hockey. So we run the program for the Games, and that's every 2 years, winter, summer. But we also run the year-round program for our sports, which is just like any other IF. So we have testing pools, we have out-of-competition testing at events, education, results management, the whole shebang. So it was something that was hard for me to get my head around when I first came. And when I first came, I think we had 10 sports. But the sports are in the process of leaving the IPC, and we will become more focused on the Games.
Very interesting. And I know there is an IPC code. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about this IPC code and maybe talk about who is bound by the code?
Yeah, I mean, the code is aligned with the World Anti-Doping Code, of course, and that idea is about harmonisation around the world. What's probably different about our code is we have 2 sets of rules within it. So we have the Games rules and the IF rules. Obviously, the Games rules apply at Paralympic Games and the IF rules apply across the IFs. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the key difference. Apart from that, I think it's pretty standard, being aligned with the World Anti-Doping Code.
In terms of who is bound by the IPC code, what athletes do you work with?
At a Paralympic Games, any athlete that competes at the Games and they sign the conditions of participation, that binds them to the code. So athletes, for example, from wheelchair rugby or boccia or biathlon, they wouldn't normally be bound to the IPC code, but they are bound for the Games period. So that's just that 2 to 3 week period. The IF sports, in terms of signing the agreement or registration for the sports that are within IPC, so athletics, swimming, etc., they are bound to the IF rules all of the time.
Oh, that makes sense. And I know collaboration is huge in anti-doping. So could you explain, Jude, how the IPC works with some of these other organizations, whether it's the PCC, NATO's, WADA, and others just in this sport movement to help protect clean sport?
Yeah, so this is something that have got a lot of energy for, and I'm really conscious in the time that I've been at the IPC that we really want to work smarter and collaborate more with other anti-doping organisations to remind them about parasport, to raise awareness and inform them about anti-doping and parasport, and I've got a ton of examples. For example, a couple of years ago, we published a doping control guide for testing athletes in parasport, and that was intended to unofficially complement the international standard for testing and investigations. And that basically gives you a really brief overview of the classification system, which is the lifeblood of parasport, how athletes get put in their classes to compete. It gives you some tips on how to engage with para-athlete in the testing process and talks about athletes with specific disabilities and the modifications that you might make to the sample collection process. And we've had some really good feedback from other NATOs about how useful that is. So that's one thing. We've also been invited recently a couple of times to NATO DCO training. So one of our team will go along and basically talk about what's in the doping control guide essentially, but just basically help DCOs be better prepared for when they're testing para-athletes. We're really lucky in that we have amazing volunteers at the IPC. We have our anti-doping tribunal is completely made of volunteers, and every Games we invite volunteer experts to come and help us run our testing program. And the idea of that at the Games especially, and other events where we might invite volunteers, is it's about creating parasport champions that they come and they learn and they observe and they learn so much about parasport, and then they go back to their anti-doping organisation and they become champions for us. And that's something that I love to see. We've also partnered with WADA, especially in education. We've done an ADEL program, WADA's anti-doping education and learning platform. It's an online learning tool. Every Games since Tokyo, Beijing, Paris, and we are now working on one for Milano Cortina. And WADA have also been a great partner for us at the Games in terms of bringing their athlete education program into the village. We also, before the Paris Games last year, we established our very first pre-Games task force, which was really exciting. And once again, we invited volunteers from NATOs all around the world. I think we purposely handpicked and covered 5 continents, and they provided input into our risk assessment and our testing recommendations. And then, like I said, they learned so much more about doping risk in parasport, and they'll use that in their organisations and become champions for parasports. That was pretty cool too. Another thing we did before Paris, we've been working with Global Joe, which is an online platform where athletes from the Global Joe countries can go in and check their medication brand. And a lot of countries have their own medication checks, but we work internationally and there's a lot of countries that have nothing. So we partnered up with Global Joe. We've got a page on our website. It's Medication Check. And you can go in there and you can either put the brand of your medication, depending on where you bought it, or you can list each ingredients and you can check and it'll take you to the Global Joe website and tell you if that medication contains a prohibited substance. So it's fairly new. We did a bit of promotion on it with Paris and we're going to do some more, but we hope that that'll make a difference to a lot of athletes, especially those athletes who can easily make a mistake by taking medication and not really knowing how to check it. It's a really good tool.
Absolutely. And I've been on this Global Joe website and it's just so easy and so quick. You just type it in and there's your answer.
Yeah, we just want to engage as much as we can with anti-doping organisations and spread the parasport gospel and help in any ways we can.
Absolutely. It sounds like you have a lot of very fruitful collaborations. And I want to go back to this involvement in developing this doping control guide and being involved as well in the NATO DCO training. I think these are critical pieces of the anti-doping programs. And I know doping control officers work with athletes with diverse disabilities, and it's really important to respect athletes' rights. So perhaps you can share with us, what are athletes' rights when it comes to testing, particularly for athletes who you work with who have a disability that may impact sample collection?
Educating and raising awareness across DCO is about helping them be a little bit more prepared for the athlete that's going to walk through their door to provide a sample. And some DCOs have more experience testing para-athletes than others, and that depends a lot on how much testing their anti-doping organisation does for para-athletes. So at the Games, we can have a lot of DCOs that have very little experience testing para-athletes, so the training at the Games is particularly important. In terms of athletes' rights, they are the same as an able-bodied athlete, with the exception that they can ask for modifications, or there can be modifications to the sample collection process if they need to because of their disability. And probably the easiest example of that is, for example, an athlete who uses a catheter and passes urine into a leg bag. So for that athlete, they have to empty the leg bag as soon as they get to the doping control station, and then that leg bag becomes their collection vessel. So you don't have a doping control officer asking them to take their pants down and witness them passing the sample directly. They're essentially providing the sample into their leg bag. And so it's really important to sort of know how to manage that and to also document what you do that is different to the regular sample collection process. And I think one of the things that we try and emphasise to DCOs is, to be very wary of making assumptions about what a para-athlete can or can't do. And we say this all the time. Maybe an athlete comes in and they've got no arms and you're like, how am I going to get a sample from them? They will know. You ask them. They're used to how they are. They will know better than anybody how they can adapt the process to get a sample that still has integrity and everything.
Well, that makes sense. And I think that's really helpful for people to really think about how this process can be adapted and still maintain that sort of rigor and the integrity of the sample.
Yeah. You talked about the rights, but also amongst the responsibilities, para-athletes are responsible for providing their own sample collection equipment if they need something extra to provide the sample. So the catheter or the leg bag. But it's not often appreciated that sometimes we have athletes who are incontinent and they don't use a catheter, or they can't, or they don't want to. So they will generally have incontinence pads. So in order for them to provide a sample, they need to bring a collection container that's usually something that sits in the toilet, and they sit on there and we wait till the sample's provided. If they don't have that device, they essentially can't provide the sample, and that's a potential anti-doping rule violation. And we did ban an athlete not that long ago specifically for that. So that is something that we always try and remind and drum into athletes and chief medical officers before games and any opportunity we can, because it doesn't happen often, but even if it happens once, it's not acceptable. So yeah, that's just another little difference.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up that example. And I think a lot of the sample collection surrounding the Paralympic Games, as you mentioned, this sort of showpiece of the Paralympic movement. And I know last year the IPC had some major accomplishments to celebrate surrounding the 2024 Games in Paris. So Jude, this is your chance to brag. Can you share some of these impressive statistics?
I don't know if I want to brag. I mean, Paris, wow. Paris was a fantastic Games. Wow, it really was. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see a lot of it because we were pretty busy behind the scenes. Yeah, Paris was fantastic, but it was also pretty brutal for me and my team. We were kept pretty busy. We did more testing than we've done at any previous games in Paris. I think we did about 25% more than Tokyo. But we also had a lot of positive tests. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Certainly, it felt like we were doing a good job removing athletes from the games who had tested positive before they even took the field. So we leveled the playing field for the athletes at the games, and that was a really good feeling. But gosh, created so much work. I think we also had a lot of positives for desolamide and benzolamide, which is a particular issue for athletes with a visual impairment. So we're still working through some of the cases, but we had 7 adverse analytical findings reported in Paris for a variety of substances, including steroids, and that compared with 1 in Tokyo. And we also had 20, I think, in fact, it might have been more than 20, maybe 23, 24 dorzolamide, benzolamide cases compared to 6 in Tokyo. And that just created such a workload for us because dorzolamide is on the list, but it's permitted for ophthalmic use. So we've still got to run a process, write the athlete a letter that can be quite scary for them, get their prescription and evidence of how they've used it, and then we close the case. So Lindsay, who does our results management, she had no time to sleep. She was working pretty hard. So yeah, Paris was something else, that's for sure.
Definitely. And just to put some numbers behind it, listeners, there were 2,677 samples. This is urine and blood from 1,988 doping control tests. Those are huge numbers for the IPC.
Yeah.
And then the total of, 1,704 athletes is what the report said from 112 of the 169 competing delegations. I mean, these are huge numbers. And it wasn't just collecting tests there in Paris, actually. In the 6 months leading up to the 2024 games, the IPC was doing some reanalysis of long-term stored samples as well. Can you describe that?
Yeah, so that was the first time for us too. We had a look at some samples stored from Rio and worked with the lab in Ghent with Peter Van Eno, who's fantastic, and just picked out a few samples to reanalyse. We didn't get anything out of it, but it was still a good exercise, and we'll be doing the same for Milano Cortina.
And I know working with the IPC, you kind of mentioned there's this consideration for certain drugs or prohibited substances that you might find in a sample, and then you have to kind of go through and understand how it might have been used, whether this is something where there was a therapeutic use exemption in place. So can you talk a little bit more about the role that the IPC plays in this therapeutic use exemption process, and maybe who's involved in that IPC committee there?
Okay, so therapeutic use exemptions managed by our medical team, if you like. So we keep a separation between anti-doping and TUEs for what I hope are obvious reasons. I'm not an expert on the TUE process, but we set a date before the games where applications for TUEs must come to IPC. If an athlete already has an existing TUE before games, we need to go through a recognition process. People will sometimes think that there must be a lot of TUEs in parasport, and that's not really true because having a disability doesn't mean you're unwell. So my understanding is it's not that different to able-bodied sport. And we have a TUE committee, which again is volunteers. I can't name them all for you, sorry, but I just know they'll all be fantastic.
Well, that makes sense. And then let's talk about what happens down the line. So you mentioned in some cases, unfortunately, you get a positive sample. Maybe you go through and you realize that this does constitute an anti-doping rule violation. So what happens to athletes?
So an athlete who commits an anti-doping rule violation, they will get a notification from us basically saying, hey, you've tested positive. Can you explain it? What have you got to say? We work closely with our National Paralympic Committees because we often don't have the contact details for athletes. So the process working internationally can take a lot of time, especially when I compare it to New Zealand, which is quite a small and nimble country. When you're dealing with different countries, the results management process working internationally can take a lot longer. But essentially, the athlete gets their notice. We ask or encourage the NPC to help them understand what's going on. They'll provide their response, and we just go through that process of determining whether we're going to charge them with an anti-doping rule violation or not. What's interesting is we've just recently reshaped our tribunal, if you like, to be more in line with the code. It's now more independent from IPC. So we just went through that process last year, and we've appointed some previous members and a whole lot of new members to our tribunal. And like I said before, our tribunal members would be the envy of any anti-doping organisation's tribunal. So if a case goes to a hearing, we pass that to our president and he sets up a panel and organises a hearing. One of the good things that has happened with recent changes to the code is we resolve a lot more cases now through accepted consequences. So the athlete will either admit to the anti-doping rule violation or accept, in the unfortunate situation where they've made a mistake, and they get a little bit of a slightly reduced ban, and the process gets resolved a lot quicker and a lot cheaper and a lot less stressful. So our process is pretty much the same as any other anti-doping organisation, with the added challenge of working internationally.
Certainly. And can you maybe tell us a little bit more about why this independent anti-doping tribunal was created in 2021, or what were those conversations surrounding that change?
Well, I think we realised that the tribunal set up as it was not completely aligned with the code. So the IPC has what's called a nominations panel, which is completely independent of us. And we did a process where existing or new members could apply, and the nominations panel basically interviewed them and made recommendations to us to appoint them. So it's about being more out of reach of IPC. They're more independent.
Well, that makes sense. And I guess thinking about the big picture, Jude, for the work that you do, what do you see as some of the important impacts of the Paralympic movement? And why do you believe it's so important for Paralympic athletes to be competing clean?
Have you ever been to a Paralympic Games, Marie?
I've not been to either a Paralympic or an Olympic Games, actually.
Well, I tell you what, once you've experienced a Paralympic Games, you will be forever changed. Mm-hmm. I remember a DCO in Paris telling me, oh, you know what, I did the Olympics and the Paralympics, and I am just doing the Paralympics from now on. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, I'm relatively new to the Paralympic movement. I've only been in it for 5 years, and I'm always learning, and I'm always in awe of our athletes. And the Games is just, I don't know how you describe it. And we only had our first Games, I think it was 1960 or 1964. So we're still fairly young. But you can see how the Games have grown in status so much from London, Rio. And with that, when there's more at stake, and that's where it becomes more tempting perhaps to take some shortcuts. And that's our role, to try and deter and detect those athletes that are thinking about that. People who work with us at the Games, we're lucky in that there is this huge test event before our Games called the Olympics, and they use the Olympics to sort everything out and make sure everything's going well, and then Paralympics comes along. And if you talk to people who work both Games, the Paralympic Games is just a little bit more relaxed just because of how old we are and the nature of what we do.
And I think that's such a good point, that they've sort of ironed out all the kinks in the system and the logistics by the point that you get there.
Oh, yeah, the test event's fantastic.
Well, I think that is absolutely wonderful. And we appreciate all of the work that you're doing in the Paralympic movement to keep sport clean and to help keep the playing field level for all those wonderful athletes who are dedicating their lives to this. And I know there's still problems, though, unfortunately, in anti-doping in general and in sport in general. But if you had all of the resources you could possibly dream up, Jude, is there one problem that you would want to solve most?
One thing that I find really hard in my job is bringing anti-doping rule violations proceedings against athletes who have broken the rules because they were unaware. They had no intention to dope. They've probably had no education. They've made a mistake, and now they're going to be banned from sport. Everybody knows that taking steroids is cheating, but anti-doping has become so tightly regulated for good reasons. And an athlete might receive bad advice from their doctor or just take a supplement really unwisely. And added to that, in the Paralympic movement, we're working with athletes that don't have a lot of resources. So they're not professional tennis players who can afford, fancy lawyers to argue their case. So they end up with a ban. So this is about education, okay? So if you had all the resources imaginable, but educate every athlete, so no athlete made a mistake, but athletes are human, so it's still going to happen. But that's the thing I find the hardest. So I guess that's the thing I'd like to change the most.
Definitely. And do you have thoughts on what could be done to really enhance education efforts or try to make it so that everybody gets the necessary education?
Well, once again, that is the $60 million question. And if I go back to my experiences in New Zealand, small country, everybody knows everybody, really easy to implement education. Internationally, wow, it's really challenging. You've got athletes who have limited access to the internet, languages, cultural differences. Our preference certainly at IPC is that athletes are educated by their NADOs, because the NADOs, it's in their own language and they're going to deliver it in a context that the athlete appreciates, the cultural context. But where that's not possible, either due to the circumstances of the athlete or perhaps the NADO has limited capability, the WADA's ADEL platform that I referred to earlier, that's a fantastic backstop for athletes, but it's a tough one. And even if we had all the resources imaginable, I don't know how successful we'd be. We'd be a lot more successful than we are now, of course, but there's always going to be athletes that either miss out or just make a silly mistake.
I think you brought up a good point there. All these athletes are human. You're going to just forget some of the rules sometimes, or just like you said, make a mistake, go on autopilot, take that supplement, whatever the case may be.
And the rules are so complicated and you can educate athletes. But I was just chatting yesterday with someone, I was at an education meeting, and there are the rules that everybody knows: rights, responsibilities, be careful of supplements, tell your doctor you're an athlete before they prescribe you any medication. But one thing I've learned from 30 years in this business is that you cannot cover all the scenarios. There are so many different scenarios in anti-doping. And there are going to be issues, and the dorzolamide one is a classic one. It's something that's kind of on the periphery. So even if you educate athletes, you can't really expect athletes to understand the little nuances that are around the edges of the rules. And seeing athletes get caught up in that is unfortunate.
Certainly. And I think there are different initiatives going on around the world to kind of build capacity for more anti-doping education and kind of enhance anti-doping.
Yeah, it certainly has been pushed by WADA, which is great.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate you sharing insights with us on the show today. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about IPC and your work with our listeners?
If you have the opportunity to go and watch some parasport or go to a Paralympic Games, go for it, because it's a fantastic experience.
Oh, wonderful. Well, listeners, we'll definitely have to put this on our bucket list. And Jude, if our listeners want to learn more about the IPC and the wonderful work that you and the anti-doping team are doing there, where should they go or how can they learn more?
Well, in terms of anti-doping, we've got a presence on the IPC website, which is www.paralympic.org. If you want to follow more generally the Paralympic movement, we're on all the social media, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, I think. So go to the website first for anti-doping.
Excellent. Well, listeners, get connected with the IPC. Check out their website to learn more about their anti-doping efforts. And Jude, thank you so much for joining us on the show today to tell us more about yourself and your work.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed chatting to you.
Well, it's been a pleasure to learn more. Wonderful to have you on the show. And listeners, always great to have you here with us as well. And please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.